invited guests in the virtual world. Sorry for the slight delay. We had a little bit of issues trying to figure out how this hybrid setting is going to work. It's going to be weird because I actually have physical people here, but I'm going to be mainly talking to the screen. But a very warm welcome to everyone. And firstly, some apologies on our end for the confusion in both the physical venue information confusion as well as the timing. And I'm very glad that all of you are able to make time for the talk this afternoon. So before we proceed, we're just going to have a short housekeeping information. So as Mariam Jamila, our technical person, has kindly mentioned in the chat box, we ask that you will mute your microphone during the talk itself, as well as switching off the camera to help with the bandwidth of the Wi-Fi. And kindly do use the chat box, okay, for posting your questions, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end of the talk. So without further ado, allow me to introduce our speaker for this afternoon. So we have with us Olivia Rendon, who's an environmental economist at Plymouth Marine Laboratory. So she specializes in evaluation of ecosystem services and its application to sustainable marine and coastal management. So she comes all the way from the UK. She was actually in Australia last week, and she will be speaking on some work about blue carbon benefits, focusing on the financing side. So so we are having the projects of the UK funded Nexus Action for Sustainable Mangrove Management, as well as the British Council funded COASTAR project hosting Olivia, and I'm very glad that she's able to come all the way here to share some of her work and insights with us in person. So without further ado, let me just pass the mic over to Olivia.
Thank you, Dr. Amy. I'm just sharing my camera quickly so people can see me. Hello, before I start sharing my slides. Works okay. You can see them, but I can't. Oh, I just okay. I just don't know if I can move them forward the slide. Sorry, I think I need to have them here to be able to. I think it's the option with the window, but okay. It works. Thank you for your patience. So hello everyone online and in person. Thank you for making time to be here. I hope it's worth your while. I'm Olivia Rendon. I'm an environmental economist at the Plymouth Marine Laboratory in the UK. And I'm currently visiting Australia and Malaysia to network a bit on our blue carbon work. And in Australia, I have met with the Australian Institute of Marine Science in Perth and other members of the Indian Ocean Marine Research Centre, which include the University of Western Australia and CSIRO, among other members. And that was a very good, productive week last week. They are very interested in working with us and collaborating on carbon values for seaweed or macroalgae. That's their area of interest, so we're going to be working with them. Just to say that the Plymouth Marine Laboratory, or PML as we know it, we have other people doing blue carbon research on the ecology side, modeling and other areas. I will only be talking about my research and my colleagues on benefits, feasibility and finance for climate change mitigation. But if you're interested in other areas, I'm happy to put you in touch with people that do modeling and ecology. So first of all, just to introduce my institute, it's a research institute and charity. It's not a university. We're often confused with the University of Plymouth, but that's a different institution. And we pursue research excellence to support our vision for a healthy and sustainable ocean. And we do this trying to do always impactful, cutting-edge environmental and social science. You can see there's some images of the kind of research that we do. And we cover 6 main groups: geospatial applications, Earth observation, biogeochemistry, ecology, modeling, and sea and society. I am part of the latter group, sea and society, and I'll talk about us in a minute. I just wanted to highlight that we also recently formed with the University of Plymouth and Marine Biological Association what we call the Marine Research Plymouth Network or entity. And this brings together the UK's largest cluster of marine science researchers. So if you're interested in these other institutions, we can put you in touch with them also. So the Sea and Society group, where I am a member of, you can see all the team on your screen now. These are the scientists. It doesn't include all the project management, science support, etc. And we are a team of 10 scientists developing and applying state-of-the-art and novel interdisciplinary societally oriented marine research. So in a nutshell, what we do is look at any kind of research that involves how humans impact the marine environment, either positively or negatively, and the other way also how the marine environment and the ocean impact humans positively or negatively. So we have many areas of research. Our main areas of expertise are economics, psychology, social and ecological science. We have many approaches that we use. It's quite broad, the set of methodologies that we use. But just to say that we cover qualitative to quantitative, we look at non-monetary to monetary values, statistical and econometric analysis, even from workshops, surveys, interviews, etc. And there's many themes of research that we do, but the main ones at the moment, I would say, are blue carbon, offshore renewables, plastic, light and nitrogen pollution, sustainable fisheries, nature-based solutions, and marine protected area planning, among others. So if you're also interested in any of these other topics, you can look up our group or talk to me later on. So let's talk a bit about blue carbon now, which is the topic of this presentation. And I think the UN Secretary General summed up our problem very well in the recent COP, saying, and I quote, "We are in the fight of our lives and we are losing." This is just highlighting the issue that we have a big problem with climate change and we are failing to deal with it properly. This is at the national level all the way to the local level. So this is kind of the motivation where we have for blue carbon research. And we can do this, tackle climate change by mitigation adaptation, and we do research in both of these areas. And blue carbon comes in as the contribution of vegetated marine and coastal ecosystems to greenhouse gas mitigation. So this includes mangroves, salt marshes, sea grasses. They all capture carbon, and this means that it can help us mitigate climate change. Unfortunately, blue carbon ecosystems have declined extensively through history, and they're still being lost at a rate of 1.5 to 2% per year, which is quite high at the global level. And it's interesting that most countries have committed to net zero greenhouse gas emission reduction by 2050, but blue carbon is still lacking in a lot of the greenhouse gas inventories of different countries. So some have included marine and coastal ecosystems, but not all of them. There's a large chunk of them that still need to include them. And the ones that have included blue carbon ecosystems, a lot of them still don't know exactly how to do it. They have said they're including them, but it's not clear how they're going to include it. So some challenges that we are trying to deal with in our research are the difficulty to value carbon in regulated services, such as carbon sequestration. We have a lack of ecosystems condition and resilience values. So often we have carbon values, but we can't link it yet to the condition of the ecosystems, which is obviously very important. There's also a need to understand the justification of resource allocations and trade-offs, and understanding beneficiaries and benefits of any kind of blue carbon scheme. So that's why we're proposing to do blue carbon valuation and finance research to tackle these challenges. And I had a look at where is Malaysia at the moment with blue carbon. And I have to say, it's changing every day. So you have to keep on top of it. It's anything to do with carbon at the moment, you have to keep checking every day. And what I found, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that Malaysia has set an unconditional target to cut 7 greenhouse gases by 45% by 2030. This includes obviously carbon, which is great. They increased it from 35%, if I'm not mistaken. The sectors that are included in this target in Malaysia are energy, industrial processes and product use waste, and agriculture, land use change, and forestry. There is a high dependence on the side of agriculture and forestry, which is a good and a bad thing. And I'll mention a couple of things about that in a minute. Also, Malaysia has committed to a net zero target by 2050, like most countries, but this is a very hard target to reach, and it's highly dependent on moving on to a renewable energy agenda. And Malaysia is making efforts on this side. As I said, my group works on offshore renewable energy, for instance, but I won't go into that in this presentation. So one thing that we are concerned about in Malaysia is that the target of 45% is linked to the GDP. So the emissions can actually increase if the GDP increases, which is likely to happen in a country like Malaysia. So we have to be a bit careful with that. Good things that are coming in Malaysia. Well, this month, I think, or last month, they launched the voluntary Bursa carbon exchange, and they expect to start auctioning carbon credits in March this year. This is by Bursa Malaysia, and they already launched a national guidance on voluntary carbon market mechanisms, which is to help all the private sector and anyone who's interested in selling or buying carbon credits to know how to do it in the proper way. And this also said that I've read in the different places online and documents and reports that there's a carbon trading scheme coming from Malaysia, and nationally determined contributions roadmap, and national adaptation plan, and possibly a carbon tax. So all great things happening coming from Malaysia. But if you notice, there's still in none of these initiatives, there's no mention of blue carbon. It's focused on carbon mainly terrestrial, and we still haven't found they haven't incorporated the aspect of the coastal and marine ecosystems. One of the concerns that is a big thing for Malaysia is the reliance on forestry for removal of emissions, because it is highly risky. As most of you probably know, being Malaysian, is that there's a continuing encroachment into forest reserves, and they're easily de-gazette a mangrove or an area like that. It can happen overnight, and that is a high risk in Malaysia. Okay, so what are we doing at PML in our research at the moment? I'm going to talk about 3 main areas. One is developing state-of-the-art carbon monetary values. I'm currently working on See the Value project, which is UK funded £1 million project, and on the Blue Marine Foundation grant, also in the UK, which is an £100,000 project. We aim to understand and develop monetary values from local to national scale. There's a lot of information out there about carbon values, but we can still improve on them. And what are we going to do? We're going to review the carbon valuation approaches. So you can see there a few examples of how it's currently being valued. It can be either the voluntary exchange price, a trading market, or a marginal abatement cost. These are the most popular approaches. So we're going to review them, look at the strengths and weaknesses, assumptions that are made for them, and make an improvement on them by taking into account into these values the effect of the ecosystem's biodiversity, quantity, and condition, which so far has not been taken into account. For instance, how degraded an ecosystem is. Then, once we've done these improvements, we'll apply these values to 2 UK studies. And these case studies focus on salt marsh, seagrass, and oyster beds. And you can see here in this map of the UK that we have the case study sites one is in Scotland, in the north, in the Moray Firth, and one is in the south of England, in the Solent Estuary. Once we've done the case study site approach and we've learned from these case studies, we can inform at the national level, and we will examine the UK natural capital accounts, because they currently assume that into the future carbon provision doesn't change from ecosystems. And now, after being able to improve the carbon values and apply it to 2 case studies, we'll be able to inform how to improve the natural capital accounts. Just a little note that I understand that in Malaysia you don't yet have natural capital accounts, but you've been working on them for the last, I think, 20 years. And I think here you refer to it as the System of Environmental and Economic Accounting, SEEA. and it's being led by the Department of Statistics, which is great to see that there's work being done on that area.
And they've recently
just done the first marine focused accounting, which was for fisheries in the Strait of Malacca. So there's work coming on that side at the national level. Now, the second aspect that we are researching is the co-benefit values. This is all the other benefits that we can get from a blue carbon project. So apart from carbon sequestration, we can get other benefits. This is in the same projects I've just mentioned. And we will do a comprehensive review of co-benefit values. What is this? Apart from carbon, we'll take mangroves as an example, which is very applicable for Malaysia. And a mangrove not just sequesters carbon, it can also protect from storms. It can provide value for biodiversity. It can improve water quality by filtering water and pollutants out of the system. It contributes to fisheries, among others. So we're going to do a comprehensive review of co-benefits values, which I think colleague Sun Lung has done for Malaysia in a recent paper. Then we will do a benefit transfer of co-benefits to 2 case studies in the UK that I've mentioned. And we will expand the ecosystems we cover. This is in the UK. Salt marshes, seagrasses, oyster beds, and now we will include macroalgae and marl, which is a specific habitat in the UK. Here you can see the map of our case study sites. It's the Solent in the south of England and the island of Jersey, which is close to France in the Channel Islands. Now, what we are finding is that a lot of these other co-benefits or ecosystem services or just benefits we get from nature, they're also the valuation is very problematic, let's say. And one of the issues that is being developed in the UK, one is biodiversity, to develop biodiversity credits, but also bioremediation value. This means the capacity of the ecosystem to filter water, to get pollutants out of the system. It can either store them or actually clean the water, depending on what is a pollutant. In the UK, there's a big push for the housing development industry to pay for nitrate credits. And this is already happening at the local level, but we want to inform the national level, how can we get the best valuation for bioremediation? So what are we going to do in this area? We're going to review all the types of valuation that have been applied to bioremediation, and you can see there, these are just a few. There's many others: abatement costs, replacement costs, damage costs. So we're going to assess which ones are the best and worst case scenarios of these valuations and see which ones are the best option for the UK. Then we also do a benefit transfer to case study sites. And this benefit transfer of these values, like for the carbon values, has to be tailored to the study site. So we take into account, for instance, the pollutant emissions, the condition of the ecosystem, who are the stakeholders involved, and what are the economic activities affected. Then we also look at the monetary values versus other values, because one of the issues with valuing, as soon as you start valuing nature, is that there can be issues with correlation, overlaps, and trade-offs. And you definitely don't want to have this. For instance, overlaps is where you double count an ecosystem service, and trade-offs is when you increase one ecosystem service and it decreases another, for instance. So we want to make sure that these trade-offs are taken account of. And finally, as we've done before with the carbon values, we will evaluate the most appropriate valuation approach for bioremediation and inform the natural capital accounts at the national level. Now, the other third area that I would like to talk about briefly is blue carbon finance. And I find that a lot of people don't understand what this means, right? Obviously, we're academics and we've studied, I don't know, biology, ecology, or some other area. We might not know what finance means. And just to say that it's very different from economics. But I've put in here a broad definition for blue carbon finance. It's a mechanism for which a financial investment into an ecosystem is made directly or indirectly through an intermediary that aims to conserve the values of the ecosystem for the long term. And as it says, it's a financial investment. So most often, there needs to be a return. There needs to be a profit for whoever is making the investment, unless it's a donation. Now, why are we looking at blue carbon around the world, blue carbon finance so much? And it's because we have clearly found that money for protection and restoration from public funds is insufficient and we need novel sources. And this is likely to come from the private sector or blended initiatives. And just to say that when we talk about blue carbon, obviously this means that it can be that we conserve an existing mangrove area or seagrass that is threatened, or it can mean that we restore and create a new area of mangrove or seagrass. There are a lot of initiatives already regarding finance, and these are mainly on the terrestrial side, which means we can learn from them, but we need to adapt them to the marine environment. They have been focused on conservation, biodiversity, sustainable practices, and also carbon. And I think in Malaysia, you have at least one REDD+ forest carbon project. Obviously, this can be not just REDD+, which I'll discuss in a minute, but you can also have payment for ecosystem services, green bonds, blue bonds, trust funds. There's many other types of financing that you can look at for blue carbon. So what are the challenges that we're trying to tackle in our research? One is, and is very important, is the uncertainty in returns on investment. Obviously, we have heard all over the world that investors, the private sector, has a lot of money and is very willing to give money and invest, but they need to know that the level of uncertainty is not too high. I'm sure you know about that. Also, we need to deal with the issue that often in a blue carbon scheme, there's multiple stakeholders, and sometimes that's a very complex setting. Also, many countries need to set up new regulatory requirements to allow blue carbon finance to happen, sometimes even at the national level. Political will is crucial. Some governments do not support this. For instance, the previous Australian government was not very supportive of anything to do with climate change, and the new government, fortunately, is very supportive. So now they're pushing ahead with offshore renewables, blue carbon, etc. Also, as I mentioned at the start, there's a big issue with financial literacy. People need to learn and understand what each of the terminology of finance means, and also how to apply it. And this is linked very closely that we need to be able to design appropriate financial architecture or financial models for each location. So not every financial model will serve for every location. So we aim to innovate in this area and overcome these challenges and support blue carbon schemes. So what are we doing? In the See the Value project, we are aiming to assess and co-design evidence-based marine green investment strategies for carbon. And we aim to do this by reviewing all the feasible marine finance mechanisms for the UK. Obviously, this does not excludes many types of finance mechanisms, like REDD+ doesn't apply in the UK, for instance, but then there's many other initiatives, and we aim to cover all the mechanisms that have been already implemented, all the way to mechanisms that have just recently been proposed conceptually that have not been implemented. So it's quite an extensive review that we're aiming to do. Once we do the review, we're aiming to design and test investment cases for 2 case study sites in the UK. And for this, we are, apart from doing the economics and finance side of the research, we are working with all the stakeholders involved to understand who are the beneficiaries, the types of benefits that can be generated, how will benefits be distributed across space and time. This is very important to get people on board. And we're very fortunate in that we've already got potential purchasers of carbon credits. They're already interested in these study sites. And here are just examples. I'm not going to name the companies themselves, but in the UK, we have a water company interested, a university wants to buy carbon credits, a postal partnership, a large food business, whiskey distilleries, and the Port Authority. And of course, these whiskey distilleries are in Scotland. So there's a lot of interest. As I mentioned before, that the private sector wants to invest, but they need to see that there are schemes that can be profitable. And after doing this work in the case study sites, as I mentioned, we will provide recommendations on marine investment mechanisms to the national policy and green finance. As you can see, there's a structure to our research, and we believe that we work from the conceptual side first. We develop our conceptual thinking, then we test it in case study sites, and then we're able to inform at the national level. For instance, in the UK, they are currently developing a salt marsh carbon code, which is like a standard for people to buy and sell carbon credits. So that's being developed for salt marshes, and we aim by this research to inform that code that will come out in the next 1 or 2 years. Okay, the interesting bit, I guess, of this presentation, I'll talk about what blue carbon research we've done and will do in Malaysia. This is within the FOCUS project. That is a £6 million project funded by the UK Research and Innovation, the UK funding. And we have around £1 million for this, for the blue carbon area, but that includes also modeling and ecology side. And we're doing other projects on other topics within this large grant. So in Malaysia, we're very interested in assessing the financial feasibility, the barriers and windows of opportunity for blue carbon. And what are we going to do? So at the moment, we're carrying out a review of global mangrove REDD+ projects, which for anyone that doesn't know, and I've been mentioning it, is reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation. That's REDD+. And that's been widely being implemented in the terrestrial side. Like there's loads of REDD+ forest projects around the world. And now, very interestingly, there's around, I would say, 20 mangrove REDD+ projects. So these are the first blue carbon projects around the world. Obviously, there's no projects like these in Malaysia yet, but we can see that there is potential. So we're reviewing the current projects that exist to see what makes a successful blue carbon mangrove project, what are the characteristics of these projects. And we will apply this knowledge learned to Malaysia. We're also researching high-level perceptions of blue REDD+ potential, and we have already interviewed key stakeholders in Malaysia and beyond. And just to give you a quick summary, we are finding that there's very little knowledge about blue carbon in Malaysia, which means that we have a lot of work to do to disseminate, well, I don't know, presentations like these, so people understand what is blue carbon, how can we make it work, and how can we finance it. We have also done policy analysis, looking at the legal, financial, and policy arena in Malaysia. For instance, there are many challenges in Malaysia, as I'm sure most of you know. We were discussing earlier with colleagues the issue about the conflict between often federal and state, also the status of mangroves in forest reserves and the degazettement of them. Also, but there are strengths also, because mangroves are considered forests, so they do fit in all the agreement and targets that Malaysia has made for carbon, so they do qualify. And interestingly enough, we visited Sabah last year, and Sabah Forestry Department was telling us that they've already acknowledged now carbon as a forest product, like timber. Now carbon is considered a forest, but which is a step forward in making it making it available for finance. So all of this work is coming. We hope to publish in the next few months on this area of research. We will continue the policy analysis for the coming next 3 years. We have funding for 3 more years. And the policy arena is very important to be able to see how can we get rid of some of those barriers and take advantage of some of the windows of opportunity. We will now also assess the cost effectiveness and ecosystem service stacking of blue carbon finance at 2 sites in Malaysia. I'm hoping to have 1 case study site in Sabah. We have the support of the Forestry Department and WWF Malaysia. And also we're hoping to find a case study site in the Peninsula Malaysia. And in the next few days, I'll be visiting Klang mangroves, Matang mangroves, mainly to learn about positive experiences, and also mangroves around Penang. So hopefully we can find a case study site in these areas. If anyone has suggestions, I'm very open to hearing them. So we are going to focus on cost effectiveness in these study sites, i.e. What is the economic feasibility of carrying out these, setting up blue carbon schemes. And just to mention a bit about ecosystem service stacking, as I said, ecosystem services are all the benefits that we get from nature. And more we've seen in the global arena that we need to focus beyond carbon and look at other benefits that we get from nature, storm protection, biodiversity, and so on. So we will explore how can we conceptually and in practice in these case study sites, how can we do this stacking of different credits or ecosystem services in projects. I've mentioned before, it's very important to study the benefit types, the beneficiaries, and the potential purchasers. In Malaysia, this is in line. We will continue to target banks, oil companies in Malaysia to try and engage their, and Dr. Amy here has already started that work, interviewing the private sector. We will then, using all that information, we aim to design and apply a feasibility assessment framework of what is the blue carbon potential in Malaysia, looking at all aspects from the policy side all the way down to cost effectiveness and beneficiaries. And finally, we hope to make recommendations on marine investment mechanisms to the national policy. As I mentioned, Malaysia is developing the national level accounting of ecosystem services, and I think it's a very good time right now to inform that work, because we have the experience in the UK that's much more advanced. It's already been implemented, so I think we could have a lot to say to the Malaysia side on this work. So I'll just wrap up with a quick summary of the areas of interest and research that we have, and we're open to collaborate. If anyone wants to talk to me about possible future collaboration, let me know. So obviously we're interested in developing carbon values in line with the latest interdisciplinary science. We no longer can work in isolation of each other. Like, we need to work across economists, finance people, ecology, etc., to get the best value carbon values for blue carbon and any kind of carbon project. We need to improve the evaluation of co-benefits. As I mentioned, there's a lot of work to be done on bioremediation of water filtration that needs to be developed. We're going to work on it in the UK. But there's other ecosystem services, as probably people that work on the topic know, like cultural ecosystem services is a big issue. And we are likely to work on this topic in Australia with Aboriginal cultural services. Also, we're interested in understanding barriers and drivers for blue carbon projects and mechanisms at all levels. We want to identify, in the end, our aim is to identify high feasibility and socially acceptable hotspots for blue carbon financing, and linking up with the finance sector to make those schemes and projects a reality. Also, we're interested in designing context-specific innovative finance mechanisms. As I said, not one finance model fits everywhere, so we have to be context-specific. And finally, I just want to end saying that often a blue carbon or a carbon project is not the answer in every location. So we also work on exploring potential of other market mechanisms for other ecosystem services. For instance, I'm currently in discussions with different trust funds in Mesoamerica because they're interested in setting up finance mechanisms to conserve coral reefs in Mesoamerica for their storm protection benefit. And there's other initiatives on this area. So I'll just give the acknowledgements to my funders who allowed me to come here and visit Australia, which is great. And also our key partners and the different projects that we have. And I just thought I would end mentioning for the academics that are joining us that currently in the UK, the Newton International Fellowships are open and you can apply by March 28th. And this is anyone who's got a PhD and you're within 7 years of your PhD, you can apply for full funding to do it up to 3 years research in the UK. And obviously at PML, we would be happy to talk to anyone that would like to be hosted at the Plymouth Marine Laboratory. So please read the eligibility criteria, but I think the main one is that you should be within 7 years of your PhD. So here's my email if anyone wants to email me about this initiative or anything I've spoken about. And terima kasih. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olivia. I think we're gonna have to share the microphone between us. Maybe we can keep this a little bit closer so making things easier. Okay, so my time is 4:10, and that was actually quite quick. I thought that you were, we were like, okay, what's the state of blue carbon in Malaysia? And we're like, wow, that was the end of it.
Question.
Well, that's true. So now we're so we have plenty of time actually, close to an hour for question and answer. So for those of you who are in this physical meeting, we actually do have refreshments served. So my apologies to those in the virtual world. I think that I'm not able to offer you guys a refreshment. So feel free to get refreshments for those that's in the room. So now I think it's time to give Olivia a hard time. No, I just to ask us some really good, solid questions about her current work and some of the exciting work that she and the group is planning to do. So for the ones within the room, especially for those who are sitting in the outer circle, I would like to invite you to ask questions, come close to the microphone. And then for those in the virtual space, to post your questions within the chat box itself. But since we have Dr. Risman with us in the room, and I know I'm aware that IOES was involved in the natural accounting work, right? Risman, do you want to give a little bit of update on what the situation is?
Thank you very much, Amy. I'm Muhammad Risman Aidit from the Institute of Ocean and Sciences. So I think it was probably 2 years ago that we started with the idea of actually ocean accounting, because we were contacted with Professor Datin Mary George, who was in the law department, and also connected with people in ISCAN in Bangkok. So we were trying to look into the feasibility of creating something that looks into ocean accounting. And we looked into fisheries, basically, whereas other countries, perhaps they were looking into tourism and pretty much on coastal, whereby I thought, all right, since you're talking about ocean, why don't we look directly into the ocean, see whether we can look into some trends or whatever findings they find. So one of the things that we were looking at is primary productivity of fisheries, using I think 20-year a time scale of 20 years of fish landing data, and try to see whether there's any correlation. And pretty much, we don't see much, when people talk about there's a decline in fisheries, what we see is actually the inshore rather than the offshore. So pretty much, if you're a small-time fisherman, they are the ones who's going to be suffering. Whereas if you're going to go into fisheries, then you better have bigger boats and go further in, because the oceans the oceans in our area, basically the primary productivity is not decreasing. However, those which are inshore is actually there's some correlation with the deforestation of mangroves. So that's why when you see all this news, the impact is actually due to the coastal fisheries rather than the actual.
Dr. May I ask from your statement?
Yeah.
Doctor, from your statement a moment ago, my impression living in Malaysia for several years now, and traveling here on and off for 35 years, so many families and small villages in the coastal areas rely on the small fishing, almost like an SME, if you will, putting it into more conventional terms. These are the guys who are very seriously impacted by exactly what you're saying. So I think the governments have to do something to address that. Because now there's the small scale fisheries in this country, amongst others in the region, Indonesia suffering the same way. I'm sure Vietnam, Thailand too, and they're suffering quite badly. So the governments, I think, need to really assess that obviously you've got to couple that with tourism. I'm
tourism,
going to come
yeah,
back to Dr. Olivia about that in a few moments, but these are things that have to be balanced very carefully.
yeah.
I'm not sure the governments have yet got that to
Yeah, that was one of the things because we were thinking in terms of, as I said, the ecosystem services, and it is possibly a tool for a policymaker or decision-making tool. So if you are talking about coastal environments, do you keep it or do you develop it, especially when we are thinking in terms of land use, you know? So is it worth changing it into, let's say, tourism, hotels and things? Or do we still need to keep it as natural as possible? And will it be able to sustain whatever, livelihoods and industries that is occurring at that time? So this is something that addressing the type of valuation that needs to be done, and how does that relate into monitoring? And how do we, whether all the parameters are incorporated or included in those things. So I think that was where the preliminary was. So, and we do remember that at the EPU level, there was an interest, but suddenly it shifted to the government story. So again, I think we need to look again with the Department of Statistics, so where would we go from here and see how what are the potential applications. Sometimes the idea is the same, but pretty much I think it all boils down to that ecosystem services and see what how do we translate that into the monitoring and how it's going to help with decision makers.
Thanks very much, Rizwan. James, you mentioned you have a question that you wanted to ask about tourism. So do you want to follow on with that?
Thank you, Dr. Amy. Yes, I actually have two questions for Dr. Olivia. The first one is related to this subject. One of the things I've observed over many years, if you travel up to Penang, and you mentioned you're going to Penang recently, Penang has changed tremendously in the last 30 years. Unbelievably different place from an environment, but also from an environmental and ecological perspective. The big beaches there got destroyed, the big storms, particularly the Asian tsunami. That caused a lot of impact, so that wiped away a lot of the protective sands and small stones that protected the islands. But one of the things with Malaysia, tourism now is such an important industrial sector. So when you mentioned during your talk about there being a conflict between federal and state, if I may, I'd like to suggest actually let's go and that goes down to local government. We're no longer just looking at the state, the local government, city governments have their own interest as well, as they can represent. But tourism is so important, the local governments will almost invariably permit new hotels and resorts to be built, even though there may be environmental concerns and so on, because it's such a key sector. I think we have to be very careful how we balance things. And it's quite a different world here in Malaysia because tourism, pretty much the whole country wide, is so key to the economy. In the UK, it's not quite so key. There are many other dominant sectors, including finance and others, but here tourism is so very important as a key influence on political decisions. So we need to bear that in mind when you're looking at your policies and decision making. The other thing, if you don't mind, I'll take my second question there while I'm at the microphone, if I may. I've had a lot of involvement with carbon credits for quite a long time. My company, an investment holding company here in Malaysia, we actually have an investment in a Canadian trading platform for carbon credits. So we're speaking to many people, not just here in Malaysia, but region-wide, looking at helping them become more carbon credit conscious and making it much more part of their discussion and their business decisions and their board decisions and so on. But also we're trying to help them monetize carbon credits. And there are a lot of projects that can receive carbon credits and they have no idea how to do that. And further, once they've got the carbon credits, they have no idea how to monetize them. But our trading platform in Canada, it's actually very similar to what Burst is setting up, but ours is actually a little bit more advanced, if I may say. We're helping people be able to take them and help them monetize their carbon credits. So there are a number of companies here in Malaysia that we're speaking with. We're helping now develop carbon credits. And I would like to, if you don't mind, at some point in time, a little bit like video call or anything, I'd actually like to speak further with you about blue carbon, because I think with our carbon trading capabilities and your needs, we can potentially bring things together. And that includes finding financing for a number of these projects. I spent quite a number of years speaking with some of the supranational banks, the World Bank, the IMF, Asian Development Bank, AIIB, African Development Bank. You know, any of these big supranationals we've spoken with, and they've expressed a very strong desire to help private enterprise fund a lot of these projects. I have one that I'm specifically working on right now. And once the capital expenditure is covered, the OPEX is more than covered by the carbon credits they're going to be receiving from the project. So it's going to be really very cost effective, huge, more than $200 million capital project, and it will be almost entirely repaid back in about 4 years, which is almost unheard of. Most of those projects take 30, 40, 50 years to repay the capex, let alone worrying about OPEX. So hopefully we can assist this company doing that. And if we can work with you to help you get some of these projects funded, maybe we could get more blue carbon projects actually into play.
Yes, thank you, James. And actually, it's really great to see you here, someone from an investment holding company, because it's a completely different viewpoint from us academics. We're in a little bubble, in a little world, and it's always for us. It's great to see you guys engage with us academics, and also, yeah, it opens the door for really enhancing what we do at our level and bringing it up to another completely different level. I didn't hear specific questions, but you did present different scenarios to me. So just to say that
How can I help you, Lee?
yeah. No, so I think it's a bit like to what Dr. Risman says, and it's all centered about how we value carbon. It's actually the actual valuation, and because when we're talking about the national accounts, the ocean accounts, it's and how do we monetize it, and that's what I'm hearing on this side also. How do we monetize it and make it a feasible investment? Is the first step obviously is to value it. And carbon is more advanced, but what we're finding is that we need to value other ecosystem services, because more and more the private sector, I don't know, maybe we can talk about this later on in detail, but they're more interested in bundled ecosystem services or stacking ecosystem services. It's not just carbon, they want to know more. And also, we often, for us to be able to communicate to policymakers and decision makers, we need to monetize these values. And often, if we only, let's say we only monetize carbon for a mangrove, that might be nothing compared to the income that they would get from aquaculture or tourism or any other activity. But if we do the gamut or the comprehensive ecosystem services that with the benefits that we're getting, then it can compete. Often it can compete with other productive activities. But we are still developing, as I mentioned, we're still developing the science. We don't know very clearly how to, in a robust way, to monetize the nursery benefits that we get from mangroves. That's where all the marine organisms, they spend their first few days or months or weeks, and that contributes to fisheries. And we still don't know how to monetize that in the best way possible. Also, the filtration of pollutants and with which I'm sure is big in Malaysia, especially next to big urban areas and industry areas. So I think what I'm getting is that we need to move forward with valuing carbon and other ecosystem services in a way that we can inform policy, but also inform the investment side that you will be willing to, the companies will be willing to invest. It's great that you mentioned that you have interest from like a Canadian company and you're helping working with them. You mentioned also, I thought it was interesting, the issues from federal, state, even to the local level. But we tend to, at least in our research, we tend to focus more on federal and state because they have the biggest clout, the biggest weight, right, power, and they can influence often the local level. But linked again to the local level, if we're able to show them the actual value that they could get from it, from conserving the habitats, obviously it's often monetizing. And I just wanted to say, throw out there, in case I often get people that don't believe in monetizing nature. And just to throw out there that I am not saying this is the only solution, right, for things. There's other solutions often. There's donations, philanthropic activity that we often need and happens. But it's by monetary evaluation that we can speak to policymakers, decision makers. They understand money values, and also the private sector side also. They need to know what are they going to get if they're investing in these projects. And one thing is to develop small level projects at the local level, but we also want to influence Malaysia's approach in general to include in blue carbon in their agenda. And I think the scientists, we're in this position to say, how can they best do it? And that's what we're trying to do. I don't know if I tackled everything that you wanted to talk about. Thank you.
Move the microphone to for clarity. James, since you were you mentioned that you actually have a company that was interested to fund blue carbon projects. Did I get that correct?
I know the big supranational banks. I do know, Doctor, the big supranational banks, banks like the World Bank, the IMF, the Asian Development Bank, and so on. All of these banks are very, very keen for any environmentally sound or environmentally beneficial projects. I think one of the main reasons is, of course, they can be charging interest on their loans and so on, but these big supranational banks have a much more high-level, holistic view over the whole environment. They're not just specifically focused on one project. You might find a construction company is looking at a resort, for example, and that's a very focused business, whereas the World Bank, the IMF, they look at much higher level of that, and they cover blue carbon, they cover regular, they cover environmental and pollution and irrigation and drainage and all these sort of things that the private sector tend not to focus so much on. So
Right.
yeah,
So,
there are potentially lots of lenders, very big lenders that can help.
so there's like a diversification of our portfolio of investments then is what I'm getting from.
Yes.
So I think, Olivia, you mentioned about the uncertainty, right? Because when we talk about financing, it's really about investment. What's the return that I can get, right? So you mentioned about the uncertainty of investments, and I'm wondering whether this uncertainty, is it primarily driven by the lack of information from the scientific point, or is it like socio-economic or political aspects, right? That is really more influencing the uncertainty of investments in Australia.
Yes, yes, sorry. So the uncertainty happens at all levels, but it starts with just how we measure carbon, for instance, the stocks. And just like I was mentioning in my presentation, one of the focuses of our current project in the UK is to include condition of habitat and how it changes over time, and obviously also the impacts of climate change. I didn't go into climate change because that's a whole different kettle of fish. But so we know that ecosystems change over time. They're impacted by anthropogenic causes and also just climatic and natural effects from, I don't know, El Nino or droughts or flooding or etc. and climate change, sea level rise. So we need to account for all of this, because the more we're able to account for how the ecosystem and the carbon stocks and flows will change over time, we reduce the uncertainty on literally how much carbon is being sequestered by that project. And obviously also we need to have, when you set up a carbon project or a blue carbon, any kind of blue carbon project, sorry, you set up different ways of reducing the uncertainty or the risk. Also, risk is a big one also for these projects. And it's also making sure that we're able to deal with the threats to that ecosystem in a successful way. So that is also an area of uncertainty that we have to reduce. And also, I guess, a lot of investors are interested in the market price of carbon, but that's obviously depends if we're talking about voluntary market or compliance market, but that's obviously a bit an external factor that we can't control. But yeah, it goes all the way from the measurements in the field, the monitoring of a project, and also the finance model. We have to make sure that the finance model of who is involved in managing that project is going to be able to carry out and is trustworthy in that. So there's many levels of uncertainty. Yeah.
Thanks, Olivia. Since you mentioned about the uncertainty from the science side, so we have a question from Dr. Lee Chun Weng. He's asking, how long should an ecosystem be studied in order to have a reliable assessment of its good carbon potential? I'm not sure if that's there.
Yes, here, but I can say something.
Sure, to that too.
But you can correct me if I'm very wrong.
We gotta get Rosanna to comment on that.
No, so I think the key thing is how much data have you got, because you have to set a baseline of when you're going to start looking back. Sorry, a baseline from which you look forward to assess that there's actually been a carbon decline. And obviously, if you have the resources, you can do this in a few months. You can set up your baseline, assess, measure your carbon stocks, and etc. Depends how much the science for that ecosystem exists, and also obviously because you have different carbon stocks and flow numbers for different ecosystems in different countries. It's not always the same, depends where you are. So if you have the data available historically and you have the resources to set up the data to set up a project, that could happen in a few months. But obviously, normally it takes a long time and people have to get funding secured and a lot of capacity building, for instance, depending who's doing, if it's a government, an NGO, scientists can be setting up a project. So yeah, it depends on all these aspects.
Yes, James.
So can I just add to that? There are three major companies that I work with quite closely. One called Gold Standard, one called SGS Global, another one called Vera. As you've been out of the UK for a couple of weeks, you may not have seen the Guardian about 2 weeks ago, but these are three major companies that assess and verify carbon credits. What they tend to do is one company will assess an exposure and the other one will verify it. So you usually have two out of those three. There are some others which are much smaller, but they tend not to be so well supported by the various exchanges around the world. But Gold Standard, SGS, and Vera, they're world recognised pretty much every market that they can help develop a baseline for you, do the calculations going forward, and so on. And once they've done their calculations, we verify actually action those carbon credits and monetize them to.
Yes, just for the audience, the Guardian is a newspaper in the UK. It's like the main one, you could say. And they recently, if you're curious about blue carbon, they recently published a news piece based on an article it has not even been published yet, but will come, of scientists, a good scientist, criticizing. They did an assessment of all the REDD+ and terrestrial, and they found that I think it was 90% of those carbon credits were non-existent. So it's created a lot of news and controversy and debate. Obviously, I'm not. I don't specialize in monitoring verification MVR as things, but I have colleagues on the ecology side that work with Vera closely, especially now they're developing the macroalgae carbon monitoring stuff. But I do know that even from personal experience, because I've worked in the past with payment for ecosystem services and REDD+ in Peru, for instance. And I know that one of the critiques on that news piece is that one is that they're kind of ignoring the methodology they've used is ignoring a bit the local context, and you cannot do that with a carbon project. Also, yeah, well, I won't go into details about that, but just to say that there are a few things that their approach that I don't agree with for that paper. And I do think that you will always find carbon credits that are fake or non-existent, but I think the number of 90% is a bit high, the way they've done it, because you can clearly see even in LiDAR satellite images across time of of some of the projects, I've seen some responses to this news piece, and you can clearly see that there was avoided emissions and deforestation. So yeah, there is a percentage of, yeah, that is true, but I don't think it's as high as 90%. But yeah, and just to say that we do try and inform these type gold standard SGS and Vera. Normally we work with Vera because they're the biggest certifier of carbon credits in the world. And it's just to inform the natural science. We help them develop that kind of area in my institute.
Thanks very much. Interesting conversation. I'm going to move this on a little bit to a higher level question. I think Kai Kwan, you had your hands up, but I was wondering whether it's the same question that you have inside the chat box. You were basically asking if anyone in UM is working on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. NDC said that Malaysia is not interested in this matter. Source Pusat Malaysia. Kai Kwan, did you wanted to unmute yourself to ask this further? I'm not sure if this was directly addressed to Olivia or maybe it's just a generic question. But I myself from UM, no, I'm not working in this aspect directly.
Kai, can you unmute yourself? Oh, there you go.
Yeah, sorry. Yes. It's Kai Kwan here. I used to be a staff at Institute of Advanced Studies as well. Anyway, my question was really a very simple one, asking anyone working on Article 6. Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, so I'm just interested to know because one of the reasons is because the carbon credits will have a higher value if we have laws that allow Malaysia to sell it overseas. So that's basically what Article 6 is about. It gives local authorities power to approve projects in Malaysia. Indonesia is already doing it. Indonesia now says that you can't have project unless it's, I mean, you can have project, but if they don't approve it, you can't have it. So they're making some laws on that. So Malaysia is very clean at the moment. There's only one, like you said, RED project. I think there's one. Maybe there's another one in Sabah, but it had some problems because of the way it was framed, I guess. So anyway, I mean, I'm just interested to know where Malaysia is going. If anybody knows, because I did ask Bursa, I did ask people from Bursa Malaysia, the stock exchange, to give me some guidance because I mean everything is up in the air. I mean, like nobody knows what's going on. So that's the problem I have. And we have projects online on the pipeline, and people wants to invest. If you want to invest, they have to know, they have to have price transparency and things like that. So if you guys know anything, like UM is the premium institution in Malaysia, they should have a lot of contacts with the government. As well, it was 20 years ago. I'm not sure what's happening now. But anyway, yes, please, anyone can answer this. It's open to, I guess, a lot of people there should be able to give me some, tidbits. Thank you.
We're talking about this earlier, right? I mean, do you wanna? Anyone of UN wants to talk? You wanna go?
Well, I think yeah. But definitive answer, but I think that's pretty much that general feeling that all right, we understand this, but there's still no that how it's going to be done. And I think these are also some of the questions that probably for you and we are there's a few of us that was thinking, oh, probably this is an opportunity to put a proposal in order to go and see how it could be done, how we could carry this out, because I think nobody really has a clue on how it needs to be implemented actually.
James, I'm wondering whether because you mentioned about working with big banks, I was wondering whether you have any insights for Kai Kwan about Bursa Malaysia. I think we specifically on blue carbon, and we have actually representatives from the Department of Forestry at federal level actually in our talk. I don't know whether Encik Jamal wants to comment anything directly, or have you heard anything? Basically, on my end, I have not heard anything directly in terms of the policies that pertaining to well, we're focused here, Kai Kwan, on the blue carbon. I'm not sure about the we mentioned something about some projects in the pipeline. I'm not sure if that's carbon in general or is it specifically on blue carbon, but we haven't heard anything yet.
You don't have anything to add. I'm always lost for words, but this time I'm afraid I have nothing to add. Sorry, Pipeline.
Yeah, I don't know if Kaikwan is referring to terrestrial carbon or blue carbon, but just to say that as far, I mean, obviously I'm not an expert on I have a colleague, Andrew Edwards Jones, he does the policy side. I'm the economist. But from what I understand, the work we've been doing and what I've been following online, as I said, is you have to keep an eye every day because there's new things, especially from Malaysia, coming out every day. But Malaysia definitely is interested in the NDCs, which is nationally determined contributions for sure. I don't know if, and I think Kaikwan mentioned selling carbon credits internationally. Yes, what I understand is that Malaysia is trying not to get involved into that yet, but yes, you would get a higher price for carbon, especially if you're in compliance, in the compliance mechanism and not in the voluntary. So that's a choice that Malaysia is trying to do. I think it's also because Malaysia has to be careful because as soon as you start selling carbon credits, you cannot use those anymore for the nationally determined contributions, which Malaysia has committed to reduce the emissions in the international arena. So Malaysia, I think they're just being very cautious. Indonesia's, yeah, they have a lot of money and they're being very ambitious, as far as I know, and they have a lot of people working in Indonesia to do this. So I think it's just a choice of the Malaysian government to do this, but it could change into the future, especially, for instance, they've launched their voluntary carbon market, but if they see that there's no investment happening or the price is too low, they might have to reassess that approach and change, right? And maybe go internationally. But as everyone is saying, it's very early days and just keep an eye out on the Bursa Malaysia webpage to see what's coming up. I find it hard also because I think, sorry?
They hide things on their website.
Yeah, I was going to say that it is sometimes you have to know what you're looking for, otherwise you might not find it. That's what I found in Malaysia, that because they don't publicize everything that's happening, but some things are happening. And I'm sure right now they're developing, as I mentioned in the start, it's very likely that they're developing a roadmap for nationally determined contributions and adaptation plan. All of that is surely to come because all the other countries have done that, and Malaysia needs that to be able to get into the carbon credit arena. So we think it is coming. They just haven't made these things public. And I just think it's crucial, especially on the academic side, that we stay abreast and think a step ahead. What is coming? So what can we work towards? What can we inform? And that's what we're trying to do with our research.
Thanks, Olivia. So we're down to about, well, according to my time, about 20 minutes. So I'm wondering whether we have any questions from the physical room here before. Okay, yeah, well, so ahead. Yeah.
So, Dr. Rendon, my question is on implementability of the carbon date. So basically, we're nowhere near our Paris Agreement goals in terms of emission reduction currently, right? So my question is, how fast and how implementable are blue carbon projects in helping to mitigate the current carbon emissions of around 50 billion tons annually? And what is the comparison of the rate of carbon recapturing when compared to carbon capturing systems and in terms of efficiency and cost effectiveness?
Really good question. It sounds like you know what you're talking about, or you have read a bit about it. One of the criticisms that blue carbon gets is that in some places is not cost effective, and sometimes it doesn't compare to other habitats like forests. That's my main example. The thing is that with blue carbon is, I think I've mentioned it a couple of times in the presentation, it's very context specific. For certain areas where there's highly threatened mangroves, for instance, I think Peninsula Malaysia has a high potential for it. Because at the local to regional level, it will have a high impact. It will contribute a lot to the emission reductions in Malaysia. Maybe not at the national level, because you do have some very good, well-protected mangroves that you cannot develop carbon projects in a protected, well-protected mangrove. Also, there's very little information out there on seagrasses and macroalgae in Malaysia. So we need to set up a baseline, at least to be able to understand these habitats and see if there's any potential for those habitats. But I think it's often the case with our focus on mangroves is very specific to local and regional areas that it can have very high impact, and especially for if Malaysia is interested in offsetting emissions by the private sector, that can have a high potential.
I think this is a good segue question to the next question that we have within the chat box. Sorry, I'm in a very awkward position here. So Rosaini, thanks for joining in. And here's a question about any experience that you might have, Olivia, of a blue carbon work that's done by local communities beyond mangrove planting. He imagines that the immediacy value is less to local communities for protecting blue carbon rather than, for instance, cutting the mangroves or timber. So maybe this is very much linked to the local context that you mentioned for blue carbon projects.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think that if you're comparing the value you can get for carbon versus let's say cutting the mangrove for timber at the local community level, often the carbon value will be higher, just to say when it's a local scale thing. When carbon values become more competitive is with high big level industry like aquaculture, palm oil. That is where it's harder to justify a carbon project. So at the local level, that's easy. The issue is with when it comes to local livelihoods is what is the substitute? Where are they going to find these benefits that if you exclude them from the mangrove? So that's all the side of work that I was talking about, understanding beneficiaries, benefit distribution across space and time. That's why it's very important that we're not just saying, oh, we're going to do a carbon project, we're going to cut out these people from this area, we're going to pay them, but what if they don't have access to buying firewood anywhere nearby? So all of these aspects have to be explored in a project. So and also, it's a bit, as we've been discussing before with our colleague Sundong over lunch, there is the issue of additionality. I don't think this is the case in Malaysia, but in many other countries, let's say the community owns the mangrove and they are the ones degrading the mangrove, there is no additionality there because they are the same, you would say, owners, protectors, and the people threatening the mangrove. So that is more a local level, looking at aspects of beneficiaries, stakeholders, and so on. But you have to study that for any project. It's very imperative.
Yeah, I think we had our case study site over in Klein Islands. We did a survey on our cultural ecosystem services, and basically, while the local communities, the way they use mangroves is really primarily for getting food, such as fish. But when they say, why is it important to protect mangroves? It's primarily for coastal protection was actually the main thing. So it's kind of like the benefits that they get directly. It's not necessarily always synchronized with what they think mangroves are most important for. So I think that kind of aspect that needs to be looked into. I'm going to see if we have any other questions. Moritz posed the question. So Moritz is our host for that workshop in Kuching last week that I mentioned, and he is working with he has worked with Claire Evans previously for a Newton project, and he's basically also on the questions about site selection for blue carbon projects. So I think Moritz, we can have this conversation a little bit maybe offline, but since you mentioned Olivia, about in your slide, you mentioned a term called socially acceptable hotspots for blue carbon financing. I was wondering whether you want to comment on that. What does it mean by socially acceptable? And here I'm assuming what you meant is areas of blue carbon projects that's socially acceptable. Do you want to comment a little bit more on that?
Yes, as Amy said, we can discuss with Moritz about Claire Evans' case study sites for focus because she's on the same project but a different institute. Yes, and just to say that Claire is a biogeochemist and she has different aims in her research than I do, obviously. But yes, I have been in touch with Claire Evans for the Malaysia case study sites, but we can discuss further via email. Regarding socially acceptable hotspots, more and more obviously the main agenda for blue carbon or any carbon projects is mitigating climate change. That's the main objective. But more and more we're finding, one, that it's important to just from an ethical point of view to work with local communities and stakeholders and beneficiaries. But also we're finding that investors are asking for this more and more. I don't know if James would agree, but we have found, at least in the UK, that they are interested that blue carbon projects or carbon projects benefit on the social side, and some are also asked for the biodiversity side, so enhance other aspects of the natural habitat. So when we talk about socially acceptable hotspots, it's understanding what kind, if local stakeholders are, from the first point of view, is are they willing to engage in blue carbon schemes? But mainly, I think the main question is what kind of finance models would they be willing to accept? Because obviously this would bring in conservation of the ecosystems. It would bring in hopefully income. So it's very likely that they would be interested, but it's what kind of finance model will be acceptable for them? Obviously, there's areas, maybe in Malaysia or other places around the world where there's a high lack of trust in the government. So if the government is managing the project, it's very unlikely that it will not be socially acceptable in the local to regional level. So it's very interesting to explore different finance mechanisms and investment cases. We're even doing this in the UK for our 2 case study sites. It's not any finance model that the stakeholders will be accepting. It has to be that where everything, what we call it, we aim to have a win-win project instead of a win-lose where someone is losing in a project. It is very challenging. Sometimes it takes years to develop. One of our case studies, the one in the south of England, is quite advanced, and we're hoping that we're actually going to set up a blue carbon project there. But the case study in Scotland is much less developed, and we think maybe we won't, in this time frame, in the next 3 years, set up a project, but we will advance towards doing that, because this aspect of making it socially acceptable can take from months to years.
Olivia, just one thing to add to that. We must all remember here in Malaysia is a predominantly Muslim country. Indonesia is very much Muslim, Dubai, Middle East, and so on. But any of the financings for projects in these regions will almost certainly have to be Islamic finance, whether it's the issuance of a sukuk or some other Islamic structure. Almost certainly wouldn't get away with using conventional finance. So that's something that really has to be considered in making this market.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. And I think that's the case that in any country you have to fit in with the regulations that exist. And yeah, like the new voluntary carbon market here in Malaysia fits with Sharia law. And of course that has to happen. So that's what I mean. It has to be, all these finance models and mechanisms have to be context specific, right? You cannot, and for instance, in the UK, there's a push for instance, right now we already have biodiversity credits and nitrate credits that are happening. It's interesting because in other places they're developing different finance mechanisms. Blue bonds, for instance, are big in other countries, but they're not happening in the UK because the regulations in the country and the political will is can be completely different. So yeah, it's a good point to highlight.
That's interesting.
Okay, so we still have about maybe 5 minutes, but thanks Olivia for that sharing an insight on what is socially acceptable. So I'm gathering here it's really kind of focused on local communities, right? Kind of like where the benefits can be directly affecting communities that live in these blue carbon ecosystems and mangroves, as we are talking about. You know, I think one of the during our workshop on the blue carbon ecosystems last week, we had a very engaging discussion, and I noted that you didn't actually use the word climate anywhere in your slides earlier, but clearly making sure that these projects are socially acceptable and probably also climate resilient would be an important component. I'm not sure if there's any specific aspects that we look into that, because I mean, on top of the complications like looking at co-benefits, as well as some stacking of ecosystem services here, you're also considering, hey, if we're going to look at investments into these blue carbon projects, but they are also facing climate challenges. How do we kind of tackle that. So I'm not sure if you have an answer for that, but I just kind of feel like, that's an element that needs to be looked into. I do have a specific question pertaining to incentives. So one of the discussion we mentioned, kind of like where investments are at right now, they're kind of incentivizing for restoration, i.e., either restoring or rehabilitate degraded mangroves to prevent them from further degradation or to be able to restore some functioning of the ecosystem services. But probably where the incentives are kind of missing, at least, from the way I'm looking at it, is to actually protect intact mangroves, right? We sort of said that, right, we have these intact mangroves that are like, say, for example, within forest reserves, but if they don't qualify for blue carbon projects, then where is the incentive, right, to currently just, take care of our mangroves that are intact? It almost feels like, the benefits, the investments are to either create habitats where they don't exist yet, or, the degraded ones, and the degraded ones do take some time, to be able to, if we're talking about, blue carbon, to sequester the carbon to the stage where, we're able to sell them. So that's kind of speaking into the risk. So, Olivia, I was wondering whether, are there any kind of financing mechanism or incentives that focus on protecting intact mangroves?
Yeah, thank you. Just on the climate resilience, obviously that the best thing is that there's a climate model for any blue carbon project or carbon project in general that takes account of what's happening. For instance, it's very interesting because climate change is actually can have a negative effects on many habitats, but in some cases it's having a positive effect. For instance, I just come from Western Australia, which is a very dry region, and they're finding that sea level rise is actually allowing mangroves to expand to new areas where they weren't before. So that is, I just thought that was very interesting. So you have to see that there's pros and cons, but you do have to ideally model into the future. Regarding incentivizing the restoration of mangroves, as I mentioned, this is a possibility for blue carbon finance. Often we want to restore areas where it was they were historically located, is not creating a completely new area. For instance, in the UK, there's a lot of coastal area was salt marshes, intertidal area, and they converted it to agricultural land by draining the water out. And now they're doing it's called managerial alignment in the UK, where they open up this seawall that was set up to dry up the land. They're opening it up, letting the ocean come in and developing salt marsh. So it's restoring, and you can set up become projects for this, but you have to guarantee. Normally, you would do it in a very large area to make it justifiable, worthwhile, and you have to guarantee its protection for at least a minimum, I would say, 30 years, if not more. So that is very important, and we are doing that a lot in the UK, even for coastal defence. It's very important now. That's happening a lot because they're finding a lot of problems, and it's often more cost effective to just open up land to be flooded for salt marsh than to build a huge seawall. So just looking at the cost effectiveness of where that will work and where, but it's definitely you can have recovery finance for restoration and also just conserving threatened habitats. But yeah, there's different criteria for both.
Thanks for that. I'm wondering whether we have any further questions from. I don't see any at the moment within the chat box. I'm wondering whether our physical. Okay, so we have one more. Sorry, could you identify yourself and where you're from? Sorry, I didn't catch that earlier.
I'm Ryan, and I'm a Master Public Policy student at the Faculty of Business and Economics. So my second question is for Dr. Rendon as well. So are you or any of your colleagues from your institution working on using blue carbon as a fuel source in biofuel energy production? I know it sounds counterintuitive towards restoration, but it has been noted that microalgae is particularly energy dense and their performance at cold storage use of agriculture coupled with carbon capturing systems. Any thoughts on the feasibility of this?
Yes, I'm not an expert on that aspect because I know there's a lot of work being done on that. Like there's a lot of money being put in biochar and other initiatives like that and biofuels. From my knowledge, but anyone else can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think you could have a successful blue carbon project, like selling carbon credits, if you are extracting from it, if you're cutting down or anything like that, unless it, yeah, I don't see how it could be feasible. I mean, there have been, like, for instance, in the Amazon in South America, there've been terrestrial carbon projects where large timber companies, they set up a section of these large concessions for timber as blue carbon, and they harvest the other side, but they cannot touch that blue carbon for at least 30 years, the section. So I don't think you could have a productive activity and also have blue carbon, because you're also would affect by harvest, depends how you do the harvesting, but you want to conserve above ground biomass, which is the plant, and also below ground biomass. And if you have, I don't know, if you have people, machinery coming into the mangrove, if there's any cutting, you can even affect the soil dynamics in a mangrove. So you don't want to touch that. You actually want it to accumulate more and more, and that sequesters more carbon. So that's my understanding of that.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think if we have no further questions, maybe Olivia, if you have any final remarks that you wanted to mention before we close the session, online as well as physical.
Yes, just to say thank you to University of Malaysia for hosting me, and Dr. Amy, Sundung, and Mariam, your great team, excellent, especially because some of the things were last minute. So thank you very much. And just to say that if anyone wants to talk further, we can talk after this session, or my email. I've shared my email. I've got business cards if anyone wants one. But just to say that I think it's a great opportunity in Malaysia to work on this area of carbon in general, but also blue carbon. So I would motivate people to explore further research in this area, either with Dr. Amy or in your own side. I think like, it's great to see people from public policy here. It affects many areas, and the more we collaborate and work together across disciplines, we are able to do more robust science, and we can inform the government better from federal to local levels. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Olivia. I'm finding myself, even though I'm a fisheries person by training, I'm moderating talks that have very little to do with fisheries. So I certainly think that, interdisciplinary approaches are certainly the way forward to addressing some of these complex issues that we have, including protecting our mangrove and blue carbon ecosystem. So with this, I really want to thank everybody for joining in. I know that it was announced a bit short notice in light of the Chinese New Year as well as some holidays, but I wish everyone a pleasant evening, and thank you again for joining. So this video recording will be made available online. With that, thank you everyone, and please join me to thank Dr. Olivia Rendon. Okay, bye everybody. Take care.